and welcome to the latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Ted Slafsky, publisher and CEO of 340B Report. I'm joined today by Shannon and Will Newton, who are both associate editors and senior writers. Before we dive into the latest 340B developments, I want to let our listeners know that we're pleased to offer a special 25% discount to 340B Report first-time subscribers. You can go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use the coupon code podcast25. That's podcast25 to take advantage of the discount. I know you will find our new service to be a valuable investment. Also, I want to encourage you to check out 340B Report's new business area podcast, 340B Leaders Up Front, hosted by longtime colleague of mine, Anna Mangum. The podcast showcases conversations with industry executives who are at the cutting edge of innovation and leadership in the 340B space. Today, we're going to discuss the more than 1,200 stakeholders' comments that HRSA received in response to its proposed 340B rebate pilot program. Then we'll turn to Capitol Hill to discuss a controversial 340B overhaul bill that two House Republicans recently reintroduced, along with the report on 340B growth from the Congressional Budget Office. We'll close by diving into a series of high-profile oral arguments that have occurred recently over state contract pharmacy laws and another one affecting eligibility for the 340B program. Hey, Will, let's start by hearing the latest on HRSA's proposed pilot program. Tell us more.
Definitely. So as our listeners who have been following know, that for over a year now, the drug industry has been making a very concerted push to convert the 340B program from its longtime setting as an upfront discount structure into a post-purchase rebate. And that's something that providers have been very united and strongly opposing. Now, pretty recently, at the very end of July, the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, which we know is the federal agency overseeing the 340B program, after a series of court cases and some pressure from a federal judge, ended up unveiling a 340B rebate pilot. So under that pilot, manufacturers of the first 10 drugs selected for Medicare drug price negotiations next year are eligible to apply for approval to implement a rebate for those drugs for the year 2026. They have to meet HRSA's explicit criteria in terms of sort of how they can deny or accept claims, what claims data they can request, et cetera. And so HRSA put that pilot out at the end of July. HRSA said it would give stakeholders, originally it was a little bit earlier, and then now up until September 8th to comment on the proposal. But manufacturer proposals for this rebate pilot are due on September 15th. Obviously, very little time in between the September 8th comment deadline and the September 15th day that these proposals are due. And a lot of hospitals and pharmacists criticized this really short turnaround and said there's not really a ton of time for HRSA to address comments. HRSA also said during an FAQ that it wasn't under any obligation to respond or act on the comments, but nevertheless, over 1,243 different stakeholder comments came in about this pretty controversial proposal.
Well, that's a ton of comments. Can you tell us what the stakeholders are saying?
Yeah, so I was going through all of them, and most of them, hundreds of them, came from individual hospitals and health centers and other 340B grantees, and they were opposing rebates. A lot of them used different template letters as a starting point from some of their trade groups and added in their own personal experiences and why a rebate in their mind would cause a lot of financial harm to their organization and negatively impact their ability to provide patient care. So that was by and far the largest contingent of stakeholders. A number of big national provider groups, as well as state provider groups, also wrote their own letters, really strongly calling for HRSA to abandon the pilot. a couple of the national programs basically said, national associations basically said, HRSA really should abandon this pilot. But if the agency doesn't, then here are some steps that it should take to safeguard providers more. So that was a lot of comments. There were also drug makers and drug industry trade groups and affiliated groups, and their general consensus was that HRSA's pilot was a positive first step. I saw that phrase pretty frequently, but almost all of them also said they appreciated HRSA's efforts. They thought it was a positive first step, but they believe that it should be expanded to more drugs, in most cases to all drugs under the 340B program. So they had a very opposite take than the providers there. Also, a number of other 340B vendors who submitted comments. Some were saying that their technology service, that HRSA should contract with them in order to use it to facilitate the rebate. Some 340B vendors that work more closely with providers were expressing concerns that the provider community had shared with them about how a rebate would negatively affect their ability to serve patients. So it was really a just ton of comments. But, as I said earlier, this deadline for manufacturers to submit their proposals is very soon. It really remains to be seen to what extent this swarm of thousands of over 1,000 comments will actually impact what HRSA is doing right now. And as everyone's sort of on the edge of their feet waiting for this pretty significant 340B shakeup that HRSA has proposed and looks like it's going to go forward, two House Republicans also recently reintroduced a pretty controversial bill that itself would be a very significant overhaul to the 340B program. Shannon, can you tell us a little bit more about that and what you've been hearing?
Yeah. So as Will mentioned, on September 10th, we had Representatives Buddy Carter, a Republican from Georgia, and Diana Harshbarger, a Republican from Tennessee, surprise everybody, it seems, in the 340B world by reintroducing the 340B Access Act, which stands for the Affording Care for Communities and Ensuring a Strong Safety Net Act. So everybody was expecting this bill to come at some point. I think we just didn't expect it to come while everyone's combing through all of these rebate comments here. The bill was first introduced in May of 2024, and former Representative Larry Bouchon, a Republican from Indiana, was part of the group of lawmakers to introduce it, along with Carter and Harshbarger last year. We're still going through what is in this version of the bill, but it appears to contain several of the controversial provisions that were included last year. And a lot of those provisions were previously backed by ASAP 340B, which is an alliance that PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers of America, Drug Industry Trade Group, and the National Association for Community Health Centers, or NAC, formed in 2023 to advocate for 340B reforms. Now, NAC caught a little bit of pushback for its support of that original bill. And notably, it has said it's not supporting this bill in this form this year. But still, the bill looks to include a lot of things that it did last year. So that includes language that would supersede existing state 340B laws. So that means, if passed, it would invalidate all of the 21 state laws that have been passed to prohibit drug maker contract pharmacy restrictions. And so that's been something that gained a lot of attention last year, and a lot of provider advocates are not happy with. It also appears to contain provisions that it did last year that would codify certain uses of 340B contract pharmacies, but limit the use for hospitals, significantly tighten 340B hospital eligibility and the patients they can serve, add new provider reporting requirements, restrict fees for pharmacy benefit managers and 340B vendors. Now, the Republicans who introduced the bill also said it will codify a patient definition. That's another controversial topic in the 340B space. Establish patient affordability requirements, set standards for child site eligibility, and, quote, bring much needed transparency to the 340B program. And that, again, is a talking point we've heard time and time again from critics of the program who argue it's not transparent and it's got all these issues. The drug industry has been sort of chief among those using this line. And notably, this bill didn't gain any bipartisan support in the last Congress. It didn't really see much action, and it's unclear whether it'll see any traction this time. We do have Republicans in control of both chambers, so it's something we'll keep an eye on because it could move, but it's unclear whether it would. Again, people still see the SUSTAIN Act, which has not been reintroduced yet in this Congress, as the best vehicle because it is the only bipartisan backed bill that's sort of bringing everybody to the table.
Yeah, it'll be super interesting to see what happens with this, especially as you said, it's lacking the key backer behind it last year. And something that was pretty interesting to us with the timing of this, and the sponsors also mentioned it in their release when they introduced the Access Act, is that it was just one day after the Congressional Budget Office published a report looking into factors behind the 340B program's recent growth. So, Shannon, can you start off by telling us a little bit more about what those findings were?
Yeah. So again, as Will mentioned in this release announcing the Access Act, the sponsors noted that this new CBO report kind of underscores the need for this type of legislation. And the CBO is, famously nonpartisan, and they do a bunch of different reports and stuff at the request of Congress. And so this report was requested by Senator Bill Cassidy, who is a outspoken 340B critic who chairs the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or HELP Committee, and Brett Guthrie, a Republican from Kentucky who chairs the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Both of those committees deal with 340B related issues. And so the report looked at growth in the 340B program between 2010 and 2021. And it found that 340B covered entities in the prime vendor program, which is the bulk of covered entities that participate, that they spent nearly $44 billion on 340B drugs in 2021. And that's compared to $6.6 billion in 2010. And so it looked at sort of the reasons behind this. CBO estimated that a third of the increased spending during that period is attributed to, quote, trends in market-wide growth in drug spending and disproportionate growth among drug classes. And so a lot of that was spending on cancer drugs. CBO also looked at 3 additional factors contributing to the program spending growth during that period, included the integration of hospitals and offsite clinics, increased facility participation following the Affordable Care Act's implementation, and expanded use of offsite pharmacies, also known as contract pharmacies. It noted that CBO, quote, does not have sufficient data to quantify those factors' effects, but in the agency's estimate, the largest of these 3 factors was the integration of hospitals and clinics. And CBO also offered a viewpoint that some saw as controversial, that the 340B program encourages behaviors, including the prescription of more higher priced drugs, the expansion of services, and the integration of hospitals and offsite clinics that tend to increase federal spending. But it also noted that the evidence about the behaviors is limited and the magnitude of each is unknown. And CBO also did not look at how legislation affecting those behaviors could affect federal spending. And so that's sort of the major takeaways. Again, CBO is generally considered a reputable, nonpartisan research body, though provider advocates took a lot of issues with the findings of this report. Ted, can you talk a little bit more about their concerns there?
Sure. So 340B provider advocates and other supporters of the program have expressed concerns with this report. And they have said, certainly to me, that it's important to consider a couple of key things. One of them being the question of who requested the report. As you mentioned, Shannon, those who requested the report have been critics of the 340B program, particularly Senator Bill Cassidy, from Louisiana who chairs the Help Committee. Brett Guthrie is not himself a flamethrower, but his committee, the providers have pointed out, has introduced bills that would be what the providers consider to be very harmful to the 340B program, including the newly released 340B Access Act, which was also released during the last session of Congress. So the hospitals have argued that bill will force 3/4 of them out of the program. So they are concerned that these questions were leading questions designed to elicit negative responses. They have also pointed out to me and others that the report may have missed some key context. For instance, the report doesn't mention the fact that 340B providers bill Medicaid at acquisition costs and therefore save this program, which is a federal state program, tons of money. This is savings that goes directly to Medicaid's coffers, they argue, rather than states having to try to collect rebates from drug manufacturers on the back end. And they point out that this is money that the providers in the program simply hand over to the government, which is a deficit reducer rather than increasing the deficit. They also have pointed out to me and others that the CBO report's findings conflict with the previous reports that have all found that the 340B program does save money for the government instead of raising costs. So this is the first time the CBO has actually determined that the 340B program raises costs for taxpayers rather than reduces costs. And I was actually surprised that they didn't. The CBO didn't look into the fact that there's this acquisition billing requirement. So it'll be interesting to see how others respond in the coming weeks. They've also mentioned that a lot of this growth has to do with the expansion of the program to rural hospitals and due to the allowance of multiple contract pharmacies. And the provider advocates say that 340B expansion has enabled rural hospitals to stay afloat and has allowed patients to access their medications closer to home and at an affordable price, both of which they argue saves money for taxpayers. So I don't think this will be the last discussion or the last CBO report. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ted. And before we continue, let's take a moment to hear from one of our great sponsors.
CompassRx is the premier AI services platform built exclusively for 340B. With our unique blend of pharmacy and AI expertise, we help you maximize your 340B savings by maximizing pharmacy capture rates, putting your team into hyperdrive, and ensuring you aren't leaving any money on the table. Our mission is to unlock the power of AI for 340B. Head to CompassRx.com to learn more and see if AI can solve your magic wand problems.
There were also a number of high-profile oral arguments in federal appeals courts recently with potential major 340B implications. Will, can you start by telling us about the hearings you covered on state contract pharmacy access laws last week?
Yeah, definitely. And to step back and set the stage a little bit, as a lot of our listeners remember, starting in around 2020, several drug manufacturers began placing restrictions on contract pharmacy use for covered entities. Their argument being that the 340B statute is silent on delivery, therefore they can place conditions on the delivery of 340B drugs. After that happened, a number of states stepped in and said, okay, well, if the 340B statute is silent on delivery and contract pharmacy restrictions are delivery conditions, then we're going to use that silence and rely on traditional state health regulation authority and pass our own laws that say drug makers cannot restrict the delivery of 340B drugs to contract pharmacies. Now, fast forward all the way to 2025. As we've covered a lot on this podcast, there are now 21 different states that have laws in effect that prohibit drug makers from placing contract pharmacy restrictions. And almost all of them have faced multiple drug industry lawsuits. Most of those are ongoing and under appeal, and they've been making their way through the federal court system, which starts with federal district courts that are all over the country. Then we have 13 federal appeals courts, and then finally the Supreme Court. And so far, the one that's underwent and withstood the most judicial scrutiny is the law in Arkansas, where a federal district court upheld it, and then the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously upheld Arkansas's law. And so far, it is the only federal appeals court that has made a ruling on one of these 340B contract pharmacy access laws. The judges there said 340B statute's silent on delivery, so states can go ahead and do this. Pharma, the drug industry trade group that filed the complaint, tried to get it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined. And it's likely, though, now the drug industry is hoping to get what's known as a circuit split, where they convince a different federal appeals court to come to a different conclusion than the Eighth Circuit did on Arkansas. And that, in turn, they think could increase the likelihood that the Supreme Court will rule on the issue. So that's a big bit of context there. And what happened pretty recently is in the past 2 weeks, we've had oral arguments related to appeals of 3 other laws in Louisiana, Maryland, and West Virginia. All of them are pretty similar to Arkansas's law. We had courts at the federal district court level sided with the states, sided with Louisiana and Maryland in those cases. However, though, a federal district court in West Virginia issued a preliminary ruling against the state, siding with the drug industry. All of those have been appealed, and all of those were at the federal appeals court level recently at the 4th and 5th Circuit. And I watched all of those. I know Shannon and Ted also watched a lot of them, and it was pretty interesting for sure. And these judges were definitely asking a lot of tough questions to all parties. Most notably, there was a lot of scrutiny on the drug industry lawyers, and some judges even accusing themselves of contradicting their position, saying, okay, when it comes to contract pharmacy restrictions, you've been arguing that the 340B statute is silent on this, so you're allowed to. But then when states try and put their own regulations, now all of a sudden you're saying the 340B statute is not silent on it. So there was some tense moments and arguments related to that. On the other side, though, there was a lot of scrutiny on states, and in particular about the argument the drug industry has been making that these contract pharmacy laws constitute an unconstitutional taking of private property. Basically, what the drug industry and what judges seem to be saying is that, okay, while the federal 340B program is voluntary, if states are all adding on additional regulations related to that, does that make the program voluntary? Does that supersede Congress's control of it? So there were some pretty interesting questions there. Again, almost all of the courts so far have gone with the states, but this is something to very, very closely follow, because if just one of these appeals courts comes to a different conclusion than the Eighth Circuit did with Arkansas, then we have a pretty high chance of going to the Supreme Court, where I think the drug industry seems to like their chances, especially with the court that has been, pretty preferable to business interests in many other cases. So that is something that we are very, very closely watching. Then there was also some federal or oral arguments in a completely different case, also before a federal appeals court, that also had to do with the 340B program, and specifically a lawsuit by couple of a big group of Texas hospitals. So Shannon, I know you've been closely following that and watched all the oral arguments there. Can you give us an update?
Yeah. So on September 2nd, a 3-judge panel from the U.S. 5th Circuit Court of Appeals heard oral arguments in a case that revolves around a 2023 HHS final rule. So a group of Texas hospitals challenged the rule, which is the Inpatient Prospective Payment Services, or IPPS, final rule, which would affect some hospitals' 340B program eligibility because it altered how days are counted for patients covered by Section 1115 Medicaid demonstrations which are used to determine hospital Medicare DSH adjustment percentages. And so the number of low-income and disabled patients a hospital serves is a key factor in 340B eligibility for disproportionate share hospitals, also known as DSH hospitals. And so that's sort of the crux of the issue here. The oral arguments were not as fiery as the ones that Will covered. They lasted about 45 minutes. HHS defended the policy, while the hospitals, which include several Baylor, Scott, and White health facilities, urged the court to declare the government rule unlawful. The arguments came nearly a year after HHS, which was then under President Joe Biden's leadership, appealed to the Fifth Circuit. A Texas federal district court had declared the IPPS final rule unlawful and halted its enforcement. So the hospitals have argued that the rule is in direct conflict with Medicare statute, and imposes adverse impacts on plaintiffs and other DSH hospitals in Texas. And their attorney told the court that the IPPS rule would lower hospitals' Medicare DSH adjustment percentage and hence their ability to access the 340B program discounts. HHS disputed the hospital's allegations, argued that they can obtain full relief, including recovery of any underpaid DSH payments with interest through the existing administration process and subsequent judicial review. The agencies further argued that just 4 of the 14 hospitals that are suing over the rule may lose 340B eligibility. And the DOJ attorney who argued on behalf of HHS told the court that the hospitals are claiming an injury relating to 340B, but have failed to, quote, articulate a legal substantive theory that is different from Medicare with respect to 340B. So basically arguing these are 2 different issues here.
Yeah, that's interesting, Shannon. I know that some of those hospitals in Texas are concerned about losing their 340B eligibility. Judge Edith Jones, who actually was at one point considered for a Supreme Court justice position in one of the Republican administrations, she expressed some concerns about how the HHS policy could hurt DSH hospitals. Could you tell us a little bit more about her response? I thought that was quite interesting what she said.
Yeah, so even though there was a 3 judges on this panel, Edith Jones, who was an appointee of Ronald Reagan, was really the only one asking questions. And, at one point she asked, what is the policy rationale behind, quote, frankly, screwing these hospitals out of reimbursement through these demonstration programs that the government already approved? The HHS attorney said that the purpose of the DSH reimbursements is not to get the most money for hospitals. It's supposed to be a proxy for low-income patients. Jones also argued that if the hospitals don't get the money, then they could either charge more for people with private insurance or take a loss. And she noted that the potential losses to the hospitals is in the tens of millions. And she said that that's, quote, not chicken feed. So again, we don't exactly know how she's going to rule or how the court's going to rule, but I thought that, her comments were very interesting. The fact that she didn't really seem to be buying HHS's arguments here. And so we'll see what comes out. But, for 340B advocates, for hospital advocates, especially in Texas, this looked like a welcome sign.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what happens next once the 3-panel meets and makes a decision on this case. But I know certainly the folks in the state of Texas will be keeping a close eye on this, and perhaps others in other states. With that, we've covered a lot of issues today. It's been a really kind of exciting time in the 340B program. And you guys have been working tremendously hard with generating lots of good content. This week has been quite busy. So I want to thank you both for your time, and we will keep an eye on all these developments and others, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. Of course, we'll report on anything that happens in the meantime on our website, and please follow along with our twice-weekly newsletters. And just one last reminder, if you're not currently a subscriber, you could take advantage of our 25% discount for first-time subscribers by going to 340breport.com, clicking the subscribe button, and using the discount code podcast25. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate all of you who are listening to us and reading our publication.